My name is Robert Reiter. I am the outgoing president of the Association for Documentary Editing, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the Association for Documentary Editing's 2023 annual meeting plenary session. This year's plenary session is titled A Keynote Discussion on Public Humanities and Indigenous Voices. And we are particularly fortunate to have as speakers and discussants Shelly Lowe, Chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and Linh Moreau, Secretary General of the UNESCO Memory of the World Committee for Asia and the Pacific. We thank you both for taking the time to share your perspectives and engaging us in this discussion. We are also particularly very fortunate to have as a facilitator of this discussion, our colleague, Christopher Brick, who I'm very pleased to introduce now and will provide more comprehensive introductions. Thank you all again for this exciting plenary session.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you to all the familiar faces I see around the room. It's wonderful to be back in person. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's wonderful to be back in person. Thank you, Serenity. Thank you, Michael Cohen. Thank you, Bob, for the leadership at ADE. These last 4 years, they have not been easy, not at all. I think it's particularly special occasion for me to be able to welcome dear friend and warm ADE welcome for the wonderful NEH chair, Shelly Lowe. She joined us today. She's our VIP. I thanked her. It's the first thing I said to her as we walked up with her. Thank you for joining us, Chair Lowe. And also joining us live from Bangkok is another dear friend and colleague, Linh Moreau. Linh Moreau is Secretary General of the UNESCO Memory of the World Committee for Asia and the Pacific. I want to pay tribute to the leadership she gives to that work, particularly with respect to indigenous languages and the sustainability of indigenous texts. It's incredible stuff. And this is so special for me in particular, because for the last 12 years or so, I don't know how many of you know this, but the United States has not been participant in the humanities apparatus of UNESCO, or any piece of UNESCO for that matter. That has changed under the new Biden administration. The leadership of the Biden administration has rejoined UNESCO as of next month. And so the humanities spaces of these two great institutions, the federal government, and relies on NEH to provide leadership in the humanities space. And so I've come to know and respect and adore so many of the colleagues that I know from NEH, but there's been no counterpoint at all with the international context and the UNESCO humanities apparatus, which Linh is going to talk to us a bit about that. And I just wanted to share with all of you a little bit about what kind of opportunities this is going to open up for exactly the kind of people with our skills and our interests and our energy. I mean, ADE is a really DIY space a lot of the time. And so these projects need us more than ever, really. I mean, and we need them too, right? Don't we all? And so without further ado, I want to toggle over to Chair Lowe. Thank you for joining us again. Thank you for being our guest VIP. And if I might, we have to toggle this mic back and forth. So excuses, we make this look easy. But Chair Lowe, what is NEH doing right now on indigenous languages and texts? I mean, I think that's the first thing all of us want to know and hear more about.
Thank you. First, thanks to Robert for the introduction and the invitation to come and speak with everyone here today. And thank you so much, Christopher, for opening us up. I do want to introduce myself first. Shelly Lowe, Yanishia, Bilagana Nishlin, Anastasia Tachini Bashachi, Bilagana Dashache, do Trabaha Dashanale, Lo Trantiel de Nasha. Do Washington, Michigan. My name is Shelly Lowe. I'm Navajo. I'm originally from Ganado, Arizona. I live and work here in Washington, D.C. And I think it's always important as Native people, we've been taught, we introduce ourselves in our indigenous language and our native language. One, because if you're Navajo and you're in the room, you understand whether or not we're related if we have the same clan. So everyone here who's Navajo has the same clan as me, raise your hand. Ah, dang. All right. Wrong audience, wrong audience. But it's also important because it's part of a conversation that I have to have, and many Indigenous people have to have, about the fact that I'm a Navajo lifelong language learner. I was not taught Navajo. I was not taught in the home. I was not taught at school. And I was not taught for very specific reasons. And I think that many of us are very familiar with that history. But it's a living history that I live with every single day, that my children live with, that my siblings and my cousins live with, and even that my parents live with, right? That we were told, you do not need your Indigenous language anymore. You need to speak English, and you need to speak English very well, particularly if you wanted to be educated and you wanted to do well in the world. And as Indigenous people, we value education. We really value education, and we want to do the best that we can in education. So many of us speak English and speak English very well for the most part, right? The pandemic really messed that up for me a little bit, I have to say. But we don't have those languages anymore. And it's extremely important for us to understand why we don't have those languages, but to understand that those languages in many instances are still there, are still alive, are still being taught, learned, and listened to and spoken. But there's a lot of work that we have to put into that. And that work has to be done by not just tribal people in terms of capturing our languages, speaking our languages at home, teaching it in schools, but we need researchers, we need scholars, we need archivists helping us with those language issues as well, because much of our language oddly is written, oddly is in a form that we can kind of go back to and pull forward. Wampanoag Language Reclamation Program is a really great example of that, right? So what are we doing at NEH? One, it's really important at NEH to make that statement that Indigenous languages are valuable, that Indigenous languages are important, that Indigenous languages play a role even in the contemporary world today, even outside of those Indigenous communities, right? We need to have these Indigenous languages because we need to be able to access the knowledge that these languages have embedded within them. So at NEH, we've had an 18-year partnership with the National Science Foundation. And this 18-year partnership is for a program called Dynamic Language Infrastructure, and it's documenting endangered languages fellowships. This program brings in linguistic scholars, linguistic researchers, to really look at endangered languages and to do the work that these languages need to, one, be brought back, right, to be restored, to be refound, and then to bring those materials together so that eventually those languages can be retaught, or those languages can be put into materials and put into resources that can be used to reteach that language or to learn from that language and to access the knowledge that's within those languages. I want to acknowledge really quickly, this is under our Preservation and Access Division in conjunction with our Research Division. And I want to say that we have Jason Buffetti here, one of our staff, who's long serving NEH staff member, program officer, right? Who has worked many years with ADE and, has been, because of this staff, one of those people that has really helped us to move this work forward. And I do have to give a shout out to our new intern, Nina, who is here. Everybody give Nina a big applause. She's going to learn so much this summer. It's going to be so exciting. But, just to give you a couple of examples of grants that we funded under the Dynamic Language Infrastructure and Documenting Endangered Language Fellowship Program. We gave Jack Bradford Martin at William and Mary a grant to write an online dictionary for the Muskogee grammar. And this, of course, if you are familiar with Joy Harjo, is her language. It's her Muskogee language. And it's something that she sometimes draws upon in her poetry, but it's something that all Muskogee people should be able to draw upon. And I really like to say that this work is, it takes a long time sometimes. It is a lot of working within archives and records, but it's so fulfilling and important and wonderful when it gets done and it gets transitioned into curriculum and materials that communities can use. I do also want to say that we have a few years ago given $2.5 million to the First Nations Development Institute, who worked with 45 nonprofit organizations, Native-run nonprofit organizations, to really focus in on immersion programs, native language immersion programs. And this was key to helping some of these programs really develop teacher training and teacher workshops and developing curriculum that could be used within these immersion programs that will just access and provide more information for the community, but for children who are in classrooms and who are able to not just go into school and hear this and when they're at school, but maybe even be able to go home and talk to individuals at home, grandparents, or introduce family at home to the language as well. And those are just a few examples. I mean, we've got a number of grants that we've provided under our language infrastructure program, but it's important work, and stating that it's important, supporting that work are some of the steps that NEH is taking.
Thank you. And Cheryl Lowe and I, before we
Chris?
here, we chatted a bit about the impact just within the last few years. I had gotten the opportunity to do some podcasting with the Organization of American Historians, which I know plenty of love for that organization in this room too. My favorite episode that we produced was produced by a native scholar in Oklahoma who incorporated a lot of the Diné Navajo language forms into the history work that she was doing for the podcast. And it completely changed not just, what I was able to take from it, but I was able to share with students. And I think what listeners were able to derive, that changed the story. As saying that preservation is one of these things that has this reputation for being stodgy and sort of desiccated, but it actually has this application that I found redounding in so many fruitful and generative ways. And there's a lot of this work going on in the international context too. I mean, this organization in particular has, I think, because of the grant systems and the markets that we're tied to for the work that we do, we tend to focus very much on American stories, right? But there is this whole international context that is really always been there and is still there and is going to be more active in the United States than has been for a long time. So one of those things, last year, the UN General Assembly, I think, and I'm going to ask Linh Moreau, Secretary General Moreau, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And what is the International Decade Campaign? And could you tell us a bit more about what's happening in the international space and with UNESCO on Indigenous languages and texts?
Hi, Christopher, and hi, Shelly, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having me here today. It is truly an honor to be here. I think this is my second talk in the US so far, so I'm very excited to hear what everyone has to say. And it's very exciting to learn what is happening with Indigenous languages at NEH and in the US in general. So yes, I'd be happy to tell you about UNESCO. Well, actually, it's a UN-wide initiative to celebrate Indigenous languages through the International Decade, which began in 2022 and will go on until 2032. So the idea behind the Indigenous languages, the International Decade program, is to find ways to preserve access and to create an enabling environment for the transmission of Indigenous languages to future generations. So that goes from documentation and also encourage their use in public domains, whether it's the domain of culture, politics, and therefore by extension, increase access to education and employment opportunities. But we would have to have a different approach in all the different regions of the world, because Indigenous languages mean something different in every part of the world. And even within the Asia Pacific region, a region of 43 countries, each country considers Indigenous languages to be a different thing in itself. So we're working together with UNESCO field offices and with UNESCO headquarters to find localized and regional and international strategies to be able to encourage the use and transmission of Indigenous languages. And so with that, we're trying to incorporate it pretty much into all of UNESCO's programs, because UNESCO has been designated as the lead UN agency to implement the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, because it's being education, science, and culture. It makes sense for our agency to do so. And so every section, whether it's the education sector or the social and human sciences section, the culture section, personally, I am in the communication information section. We are all incorporating, celebrating or including Indigenous people's organizations, Indigenous representatives in the activities that we're doing. So for example, we have just finished at UNESCO Bangkok, we've just implemented a project in Cambodia where we partnered with a local NGO to, they call the Bopana Foundation, and we trained them to produce documentary films to document their own Indigenous language and culture. So there were 30 youths from 5 different Indigenous communities of Cambodia. And that is all now available for public access on Wikimedia Commons. That was really fun to do. The youth were really engaged, and we would like to see more of that, especially in the media, because that is somewhere where Indigenous languages are very absent and we need to see more of. So that's just an example of the things that we do. The education section are really trying to push for Indigenous languages, or also which they call mother tongue language, which is sometimes more applicable in an Asian context, to push for legislation and for it to be more included in educational systems, amongst other things. So I hope that kind of explains what we're trying to do here.
Thank you very much. No, that's wonderful to hear about. And I see, you know, like eyes opening and hands going up even. We are going to have Q&A, you know, at the end, but I wanted to spend a bit more time with Chair Lowe and Secretary General Moreau first. It seems to me a lot of the people you mentioned preservation and access, Chair Lowe, as key components of what's happening in this work right now in this field. It seems to me that the other components of NEH, I think like most of us will have had experience with the scholarly editions. It seems like that has real applicability in this context too. And so what kinds of projects, you know, that are happening that excite you right now that you see in the documentary editing space? And do you see more of that happening with respect to scholarly editions?
Well, I think that we'll always look forward to seeing more happening in the scholarly editions and scholarly translations. I think, you know, there's so many things that come through NEH that are super and amazingly exciting. What I find most exciting is when projects start to come in. You know, we're looking at a single set of materials, whether they be letters, whether they be personal papers of somebody, but another project comes in and maybe unbeknownst to the 2 groups and the 2 researchers working on these things, they actually start to overlap, and we get to see those within the agency where those overlaps happen. And that's when you get really excited. That's when you can say, wow, you know, this work's going to come together at some point, and it's going to inform a whole lot more people in many more different ways. And I think that that's one of the things that gets really exciting. One of the things that I really want to kind of stress is that there's also this, you know, really interesting idea of what does it mean to think a little bit more about what we're not doing when we think about scholarly editions and scholarly translations. You know, we've got kind of a set of materials that we've looked at, that we've been used to kind of thinking about. What are the kind of materials and the kind of individuals that we haven't been looking at? And I think that's the thing that is also extremely exciting, is to really say, you know, out there, what needs to be looked at that we haven't looked at yet? What can we bring forward that might be new, that will be interesting, that will bring an even fuller story forward and more knowledge into who we are as American people, what our history looks like, One of the areas that we're working right now, many of you may know, we just signed an interagency agreement with the Department of the Interior, and they're working on the boarding school initiative currently. So our funding, which we have provided to the Department of the Interior, will help digitize materials, documents, letters that are in the National Archives. And I just met one of the researchers working in the archives, and she's been doing some of this work for a while, but it's really ramped up, with NEH support. And she talked about what it's like to be in those archives. And many of you know what this is kind of like. It's really exciting that you find one document and you find a name, or you find kind of a story that you were looking for. And she said she tries real hard not to go down that rabbit hole, because she'll get lost and she'll steer away into other things. But the funny part, she said, was, I had to take a class to learn how to read some of these documents because the English was written differently. Right? It was from a different time, and the words that they used had been a little bit different, and the handwriting was different, right? This is exciting too, because I know how many of you understand kids don't read cursive anymore, right? And what is that going to mean down the road? What is it going to look like when we go into text and when we say to kids, you need to understand and read this? Oh, guess what? We're going to have to translate that for them. We're going to have to make new additions for them to be able to understand that. But it's exciting to see where this work can go. The thing that excites me about the Federal Boarding School Initiative is that these are materials that some people have had access to, but the general public, and particularly tribes and families, have not had access to. Although it's a good thing to bring this material forward to have a better understanding, what we also understand is this is going to be a difficult thing to bring forward for individuals to actually have access to be able to look at and to see, because there are many questions unanswered. And right, what's the point of NEH? To make sure material's there so you can answer a question. But some of those questions are going to be hard, and some of that exercise and going through it is going to be very difficult. And even the researcher talked about this, how difficult it is for her sometimes to come across documents and to think about, what does it mean to bring this forward? But the wonderful thing about it is the digitization of these materials and projects are going to overlap with work that we have already digitized, right? That we have already translated, that we've gone in and documented. And we're going to be telling this richer, fuller story, which, I think that we have a lot of voices that are missing in that rich, full story. And the more we bring forward, the more exciting I'm gonna get, for sure. But.
Me too, same here. I have to agree with that. Speaking of exciting things that I see, I would say over the last 4 or 5 years, is the way that you were talking about memory, the way that memory became something that just is much more part of our public discourse and informs the way that we have conversations about policymaking, I think, and hopefully for the better. And I like to think that this organization is the kind of place where that sort of thinking thrives and that sort of energy exists. But even just having the conversation and centering memory as a really important site of recovery and reconstructive work in the documentary editing space is something I've taken a lot of inspiration from. Again, that's also happening in the international context too. Americans, we can be siloed sometimes. The reason I keep calling Secretary General Moreau Secretary General is because she does hold this position with the Memory of the World program. I don't know if too many of you know about this, and correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Secretary General, but if I am wrong, I think that Memory of the World is comparable to World Heritage, which is much more prominent, that deals with environmental spaces and built environment. But there is a parallel UNESCO designation for textual materials and documentary heritage called Memory of the World. And one of the great highlights of my work, getting to edit Eleanor Roosevelt's papers for 15 years was being singled out by UNESCO for the collection. That is a collection of materials that NEH Resources built, and that became more than the sum of its parts, and that in turn, the international community turned around and said, this has global value. none of it would have been possible without NEH. I'm so grateful for that. And I want to hear more. Secretary General Moreau.
Thank you, Christopher. Yes, so the Memory of the World program, as you say, is one of the three prominent programs of UNESCO. So we have the World Heritage Sites, as you say, environmental and man-made. And then there's also the Intangible Cultural Heritage List, which I'm mentioning here because I think it's really important for our stakeholders and our audience present today to know about. The International Cultural Heritage List is inscribes oral traditions, performing arts, and indigenous knowledge and skills. So once the US joins next month, these are other considerations for inscription. And then we have the Memory of the World program, as you mentioned, which aims to promote documentary heritage, its preservation, and to ensure its protection, and that it is made accessible to all. So the Memory of the World program, it's of the world because it considers that documentary heritage belongs to all and has a universal value. And so in addition to increasing awareness, not just amongst the public, but also with governments, institutions, it wants to achieve the permanence and the protection and by and large their accessibility. And so there are different levels of the Memory of the World program. There are regional committees. So there's one in Latin America and the Caribbean, operated by MOLAC, Memory of the World Committee for Latin and the Caribbean. I am the Secretary General of the Asia Pacific Memory of the World Committee. And in formation right now is the Africa Committee for the Memory of the World. So we're really excited to see how they're going to develop. We've had a few meetings with them, and it's just been really great. And so in addition to the regional and international levels, there are also national Memory of the World committees. So in the Asia Pacific context, some of the countries that have a national committee for the Memory of the World are Australia and New Zealand. And I mention these specifically because they actually try to encourage and emphasize the inscription of Indigenous collections or items onto their National Memory of the World Register. So Australia, for example, and I invite you to have a look at the Memory of the World websites for Australia. They actually have a collection on Indigenous languages inscribed onto their National Register. And for New Zealand, they have Maori oral histories that are inscribed onto their National Register. And so, Indonesia just got one from the island of Aceh inscribed onto the International Memory of the World program. So it's just a great way to get the Indigenous languages and cultures recognized. And then the more they're recognized, the more they're promoted, and the more they can get funding. It's a lot about visibility. And so we're really happy to be promoting Indigenous languages in the Memory of the World program, as we are very happy to be encouraging items that are related to gender. So the Eleanor Roosevelt papers, for example, as Christopher mentioned, we're very proud to have that on the list, as well as other items that celebrate gender, or even just mark the hardships of women and girls throughout history. But by and large, in general, as time goes by, we are finding more and more items that we want to encourage that have been previously absent. So gender, Indigenous languages, and I'm sure in the time to come, this will also change to include more fields we would like to see there.
Thank you. And you reminded me, thank you. I wanted to mention to this group in particular that because Secretary General Moreau mentioned National Memory of the World committees, some countries are much more active than others. Because of the situation in the last 12 years, the US has been very, very dormant, but I really want that to change. And so one of the things that I'm going to be focused on the next few years is trying to build out a Memory of the World committee, I hope, for the United States that can do some of this amazing work that's happening, particularly with Indigenous texts, using Memory of the World as a vehicle to center those voices. And I guess this provides me a bit of a segue to my next question for you, Chair Lowe, which is the question of, right now, the immediacy of right now. I mean, one of the things I hear you saying is that this work has always been important, you know, it's happening more right now, you know. Why does it need to be happening even more right now than it already is?
I think a lot of that comes into, one, we have to always remember the past if we want to figure out where we're going in the future. And I know that sounds very cliche, right? That, oh yeah, we'll figure out our answers by thinking about what we were taught in the past or the stories that we know from the past. But we have a lot of questions right now. We have a lot of issues that we're confronted with as human beings that we do have to pause and we have to think about. And I think that that's exactly what the humanities does and work in the humanities. So looking back to text, looking back to the past and what we can pull from the past to say, you know, did this happen before? And if this happened before, what was the outcome? And what can we learn from how this happened before? We don't teach that very often, I don't think. I don't think we teach that very often in school. I don't think we're expected to do that very often as individuals, you know, going throughout our day, is actually pausing and saying, hang on, wait, you know, let me reflect, let me think back, let me look to find an answer from something, whether it's something I find online, whether it's something I find in a book, but let me find some information to help me make an answer or to help me find an answer and to move forward. And I think that that's a skill that we need to go back to. We need to go back to teaching individuals that you can find answers without just kind of sitting and saying, all right, let me think about these things in my head. And then, okay, here we go. You know, we can go and say, I need to look here. I need to look there. And I said before, one of the things NEH does, or what we try to make sure to do, is to make sure when you do have a question, that there's something you can turn to answer that question. Materials, documentaries, you can look to texts, you can look to even poetry, you can look to cultural heritage that's held within cultural centers and museums, but there is a place to go and something to turn to answer the question. And this is exactly why documentary editing particularly is important, because where are we going to turn to? What are we going to have access to turn to? And how we have access to turn to these materials, I think, is another question that is very important to be thinking about as well as we continue to move this forward.
Thank you. And one of the things I hope we turn to, and by we, I mean everybody, all of us, is the humanities, right? I mean, I feel like it saved my life so many times over the years, and continues to do that every day, because you can't tell the story, you know, much less of a nation or a world, but, you know, of oneself without those skills, right? And yet there is this narrative out there that the humanities is moribund, that it's, yeah, that it's irrelevant, that you can't monetize it effectively enough, and therefore it need not exist anymore. Therefore, it doesn't warrant, you know, deep and strong public investment. So this next question I do want to ask both of you is that, what do you make of that? Is the humanities, you know, on its way out?
If I may, sorry, can you?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Is a question for both of us. So because I heard the word save lives, and I wanted to interject right away before this thought escapes me. And yes, I certainly hope it does not, because indeed the humanities can save lives and can play a role in disaster risk management. And I will give an example that's related to Indigenous languages and cultures. So when the 2004 tsunami hit Asia, hit the Indian Ocean, causing thousands of lives to be the loss of thousands of lives, and not to mention the destruction in infrastructure. There was one people, the sea nomads of the Andaman Sea, called the Moken in Thailand, or the Salung in southern Myanmar. From their indigenous oral history, from their language, they knew that the tsunami was coming. They saw the sea retract, and they were able to save their lives and the lives of other people as the tsunami hit. So I certainly do hope that the humanities do continue, unless it literally can save lives. So sorry, I just wanted to share that while that thought was so fresh in my head.
What do you make of this narrative that is this bogus stuff I'm hearing or no?
That's totally bogus. I mean, humanities, I was doing an interview with President Crow of Arizona State University recently, and I asked him the same question. I said, you have this, huge world-renowned institution, and, you need to answer for me, how do you keep the humanities going in this institution? And how do you respond to this idea that the humanities are dying? And he literally said, the humanities are never going to die. It's the core of who we are as human beings. If there are no humans anymore, then yeah, humanity will die. But, and I said, I get that. I think you're right. That we can't make decisions without referring and building upon humanities, building upon what we have learned, what we have been taught. And how did we learn? How were we taught? We were taught through humanities and the skills of humanities and the things that humanities turn to give us the information, to help us make decisions, to help us decide how we were going to move forward in whatever realm and whatever decision we had to make. I also had to say that we have 56 state and jurisdictional humanities councils, and we talk about public humanities. They are on the ground every single day, and they are thriving in their public humanities offerings. But we don't look to that aspect of humanities. We often look to higher education. We look to certain realms, scholarly work, research, right, to think about humanities. But humanities is a part of everything that we do. And when you stop and say, okay, let's look at public humanities, let's look at applied humanities, right? Which came first, the research humanities, public humanities, or the applied humanities, right? It's that kind of which one's more important and which one makes more of a difference. But you look to what's actually happening, how people are using humanities, applying it every single day, and looking to how they're creating public humanities programs and what is happening in public humanities. And I have to say it is thriving. They're doing so much work. I can say for one of the most exciting things I did last week is I went to National History Day, the national competition. I've never been to National History Day before. That was fun. But it was amazing to see the projects that students did. But even more amazing was that I had the opportunity to go to the National Museum of the American Indian and see the Native Hawaiian History Day projects that were in Olelo, Hawaii, in the Hawaiian language. They were completely in the Hawaiian language, no translations whatsoever. And the students cannot participate in the national competition because they don't have a judge who can judge them because they're in the Hawaiian language. But they were able to come and showcase their projects. And I was like, humanities is not dying. They were taking knowledge from their language, from their history, and each of them had a project, focused on Hawaii or Hawaiian culture. And it was just amazing to see them do this work and to bring it forward. And to, they were really nervous. They didn't want to, present in public, especially in a museum, right, in front of a bunch of people they don't know. But it was so powerful to see that this is what's coming. This is what's going to be happening. And, I think our call is, how do we help that continue? And how do we make that grow and reach more communities?
Incredible. I was thinking the transnational, you were talking about Hawaii and Hawaiian language and how, and I don't know how you tell the story of it's like Hawaii without being incredibly transnational. And that's another context in which the work, the application really is, I see happening in the kind of work that Secretary General Moreau does. Because one of the things that when you go to vindicate, if you will, or demonstrate, the value to UNESCO of this work, they really do vet you for this. And these countries that have nominating, very active nominating groups to produce memory of the world content, it's not just national though, it's also international, because there are all these joint groups. So one thing I know, and I wanted to ask you if you might, Secretary General Moreau, tell us, I know that there's several countries in the Asia Pacific in particular that are really quite needy for American participation and interest. There's interest in producing joint nominations. So the work that goes into building out these programs is itself generative of all kinds of outcomes that reproduce themselves across space and time. Could you tell us a bit more about that, Secretary General Moreau?
Yes, thank you, Christopher. So yes, in the Memory of the World program, we really encourage joint nominations between 2 or several member states. I believe the US actually has joint Memory of the World nominations with countries in the Caribbean and Latin America on inscriptions that are about labor and the slave trade. And in the Asia Pacific region, well, especially in Asia, it's quite important because the indigenous peoples and languages, they usually live at the borders of countries, because borders in Asia and by and large the world, they're a colonial construct. Before the communities were fluid, people were going from one place to the other, people spoke multiple languages. And so when we're talking about indigenous languages, they're not just spoken in one country. So I mentioned the sea nomads. They're not just in southern Thailand, they're also in southern Myanmar, and they speak that language. The Hmong in Laos, they speak it in Vietnam, and they also speak it in Thailand. And it's important for countries to work together to preserve and promote these languages, not just through the Memory of the World program, but also, through their educational infrastructures and legislative mechanisms. And so to give more concrete examples, I know that the Philippines is very keen to talk about joint nominations with the US, because some of the documents that are from the Philippines are now housed in collections in the US. And also, from US, various US influence and interventions in the Asia Pacific region and in some of the Pacific countries, I'm sure there will be many opportunities for collaborations for joint nominations in the Memory of the World program.
Wonderful. And I want to turn it over. We're getting to that. We have about 25 minutes left. So I wanted to open the floor up. I think there are some hands that have been raised, some questions. And what is the protocol? Are people
Just call them.
okay? So who's up? Who's on deck? Ondine.
This is wonderful. Thank you all for putting this together, being here for this. It's inspiring and informative and also deeply moving, I will say. One of the things that occurred to me is the challenge that your work must face in terms of balancing the local, which you've referred to, with the really broad national and international scope of what you're doing, because I'm sure that the local engagement with the people whose language you're documenting or reclaiming, making sure that they approve of the way it gains a broad public audience. That I'm curious about how you're managing that. We're doing it on kind of like a Massachusetts level, and I'm really curious about how you're managing it on such a broad level.
It sounds like a Chair Lowe question.
Sure. I come out of higher education. I spent a lot of time in higher education working with Native Indigenous students. And one of the things that we always had to kind of stop and think about is, how would the community want to do this? How does this student's tribe or family, or, what are their needs? And specifically, how do we need to address any kind of situation or their time and experiences in higher education? When I started with NEH, I was on the National Council, and I was on the National Council for 6 years. And I was happy to learn that we had a code of ethics for working with Native American and Indigenous projects and communities. And that code of ethics really kind of states what you just said, right? Making sure that any project that was focused on Native or Indigenous knowledge, materials, or any kind of curriculum that might be created, or cultural heritage, that the tribe and the community or the individuals were aware, that they were consulted, that they were allowed to be a part of the project and inform how the project moved forward. So we try to make sure that that's always the case. And, you do have to ask questions. You do have to kind of say and make sure that applicants are thinking about that. The other ways that we try to think about this is we think about who's serving on a panel, right? So as you know, you apply to NEH and it's you as the public get to decide who gets funded. You're the ones that tell us who are good projects that should be funded and which are not good projects and you don't think they should be funded. We need more individuals who are familiar with Indigenous cultures or just more diverse panelists who come in. And we're trying really hard to ensure that we're finding those individuals and then we're encouraging them to participate in our panel reviews because they may catch things in communities that we aren't even aware of. And we hope that they can kind of bring that knowledge and that expertise forward for us. And the last thing that we've done more recently is we hired a strategic advisor for Native and Indigenous affairs, someone who really can be within the agency, helping us both in the application and grant processes, but in our administrative processes as well, to ensure that we're being mindful, that we're catching things that we need to be catching, that we're also bringing in and making individuals aware and informed when they need to be aware and informed, and just sharing information in particular, because I think that's one of the things that we find is a lot of individuals, they don't know that NEH is here. They don't know what NEH does. They don't know that there's a project about their culture going through NEH right now for review, right? And we want to make sure that they are aware of that and they have the information available.
Okay, speaking about NEH grants, can you sell it to us? Like how difficult the process is, what the application windows are, and hi again, good to see you, Madam Secretary. As a newbie to the group, it would be really helpful for us as new people and older people of the ADE to understand the NEH process because it is a little scary.
I agree. Well, I'll go through the basics of the process. And I want to point out again, Jason, who's here. Jason, wave your hand. If you have questions, even if you ask them to me and you call later, we're going to send you to Jason to answer other questions. So it is, there are a couple of steps. Number one, you want to know what our grants are, what we fund. We have 6 divisions that fund different projects, different humanities projects. We also have Office of Fed State Partnerships. So if you're interested in a really smaller grant or a smaller project that you're working on, look to the State Humanities Council first and see what they're offering. They have grant lines as well that you might be really interested in. If you're interested in one of our federal grants, you've kind of gone through the list, you have a good sense of what we do, what we fund, and where your project might fit, right? That's the number one thing is what is your project and what division and what grant line does it fit into? You might think that it fits into more than one, and that's perfectly fine. It may fit into more than one. What you can do is number one, you pick up the phone and you call a staff member at NEH. And I won't speak directly for Jason, but they're usually really excited to answer the phone. It's like they act like they don't want to, but they want to talk to you and they get really nerded out about your projects. It's really exciting to see. But they'll walk you through it and say, this project really looks like it'll fit this division and this grant line. So you want to be able to pinpoint specifically the grant line that you want to apply to. The second thing that you need to do while you're doing all of this is make sure that you're set up to be funded and to actually submit an application. You have to have a UEI, Jason, Unique Entity Identifier. Is that correct? Which can take time. You want to make sure that you have that all set and ready. You have to be set up in grants.gov. All of that has to be good, approved, done so that you can submit the application. You can go on our website and you can see successful applications as well. Look at the application and see what was involved in it. What was the humanities significance? What did it propose to do? How was it going to do it? Who was involved? That'll give you a good sense of what a successful application looks like. And then, of course, you're going to write your application. Some of our grant lines offer opportunities for staff to proof and review your application and give you responses back before you submit the final application. So if that is available, I strongly recommend taking advantage of that, because you'll get some direct feedback from the staff on how to make a certain part of it stronger, or maybe you didn't answer a certain question that they think would be really important. Once you have submitted your application and assuming that it's an eligible application, you have to follow there are quite a few guidelines on how you have to submit it within the system. It gets pulled and it gets grouped in with other applications of similar kind of topic or area, and a panel of reviewers will review your application. And when I said it's you, the public, who tell us what are good humanities projects, you are the panelists that we pull in. The program officers will reach out. They'll invite individuals who are familiar with the kind of topical areas that are being proposed to come in and read every single application. You don't read every single application in a division. You'll get a set of applications, and you'll have anywhere from 3 to 5 panelists reading applications and scoring each application based on the criteria that NEH has set forward. They will come together, not always well, we all do all of these online now, virtual. You'll either have your panel reviewers send in written reviews that will be compiled, and the staff will make a summary from those written reviews, or the panelists will come in and do a virtual meeting and have conversations about the applications that they're reading and they're reviewing. All of that goes back to the staff, all of the panel reviews and the rankings, and those get summarized. The staff have gone through each of the applications. The staff will summarize the panel reviewers' remarks and add some of their own. And these get slated into a whole big book that goes to our National Council. The National Council gets a list of all of the recommended applications and then applications that were not recommended. And in many cases, the number of recommended applications is just limited on our budget, right? So you may have had a really great application scored high, but our budget just doesn't cover enough to fund all of the ones that we want to fund. The National Council can, really pick through it with a fine tooth comb if they want, and they can say, I really want to read this one and understand this better. Or they can look at the committee book and they can say, yeah, this looks really great. Let's move this forward. The council will then meet. They meet 3 times a year, and they will discuss the committee book. So the recommended applications, the non-recommended applications. If there are any questions, they will discuss those in a committee meeting. And then all of the final recommendations after that meeting go to the full council to vote on and say yay or nay. That final slate then comes to.
Oh my gosh.
It's a long process.
I'm terrified.
Final slate. Well, you only do the first part. The final slate then comes to me in the chair's office to sign off on, and then that moves forward.
And that takes about a year?
Well, it depends on the deadline. So all of the deadlines for our grants are online. So you can look at each, if you get the magazine, if you don't get our humanities magazine, you want to pick up a print copy of the magazine, because the last page inside of the back cover is all of our grant lines and all of the deadlines.
Mhm.
It's the best thing about the magazine.
Thank you.
The
You didn't by
best thing.
chance bring any with you?
I did not. No bad now. And so, you'll look at the deadline where the council meets 3 times a year. It's about 9 months from the time an application gets started, submitted, and then reviewed and gone through the full process.
Okay.
And when you are awarded, we notify Congress first. So your congressional members will be notified that you've had an award, and then we'll make a public announcement.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for going through that, because it's still just as frightening as it was before you started the conversation, but thank you.
But it's a step-by-step process.
It's a step-by-step process.
I just have a question. This is not looking for help. I'm just looking for information, curiosity. You're looking to recover indigenous language. What percentage of them have some kind of written heritage, and what percentage of them don't? And what's the difference in the way you treat those that have some kind of, maybe purely religious, but some kind of written heritage, document, whatever, could treat those that don't? My final question, which is only sort of related, but it's related to the United Nations. And that is whether at the United Nations, you've considered looking at the languages of Queens. There are more languages spoken in Queens than at the United Nations.
Queens, New York?
Your borough.
Queens, yeah, I grew up there.
A little sidebar, but I'm curious about how you treat Indigenous languages with or without any kind of written record.
You have some responses, and before you start, Secretary General Moreau, I just want to thank you for the money question, because the sordid reality of all of our lives is that money is a part of it. And if you have any feedback about what kinds of resource constraints or possibilities you're looking at in the UNESCO context right now, I'd like to hear a little bit about that too, I think.
Just hearing Cheryl's explanation, it sounds a lot like the memory of the World Register process, the whole back and forth and the timing. It sounded like the memory of the world process all over again. So if I may just address the question on languages, Indigenous languages being written or oral. Actually, in the case of Asia and the Pacific, most of them are oral. Very few of them are written. I mean, some of them have a script, and if they do have a script, we actually really encourage them to be inscribed on the memory of the world. We have the Shui characters of China that have been recently inscribed, but a lot of them are oral, and we're still in the process of collecting data as to how many are oral and how many are written. We started reaching out to member states about a year and a half ago to collect all this data, to find out what's written, what is oral, how many speakers. And so it's still a work in progress, and it's all online. It's called the World Atlas of Languages, but we're still expecting to get more data. And how we deal with it, that's when audiovisual documentation becomes very important, and creating an enabling environment in terms of the use of the language in the media, or in the family, or in education. If there is no written form, encouraging the environment for its oral transmission is all the more important. So that's why these projects, like these filmmaking projects, and including the youth, are very important, because the youth are and women especially, because women are usually the ones traditionally in the Asia Pacific context taking care of children and transmitting the Indigenous languages, and the youth will be in charge of transmitting it to future generations. So that's actually our priority for the oral languages, and for the written ones, just document as much as we can and try to push for these languages to be included in educational systems. So I know the Philippines is really pushing towards mothers. In the Philippines, they call it Indigenous. In Indonesia, they call it Indigenous. In Thailand, they call it mother tongue. Vietnam, they call it ethnic language. Every country has its own terminology for essentially what is slightly different, but the same thing. But essentially, it's to encourage mother tongue education has become a really important endeavor of the education section of UNESCO.
Sure. And I'm afraid I don't have the numbers for you. But I think that there is the ability to find those numbers online, and we'll have to figure out what organization has that. In terms of oral versus written, we fund and have funded both cases where written materials were the resource that was being used and oral materials were the resource being used. I think there are a couple of questions to ask in that, though, that are important to think about. One is what is encompassed within the resource? So how much is within the written documentation? How much is within the oral documentation? How accessible is it? So if you're proposing a project to any age, we need to know that you have full access to those resources for whatever project it is that you're trying to do, right? You have access to the written documentation, and that you have access to enough of the written documentation to do your project, or vice versa with the oral materials. And then you have the expertise to be able to work in one or the other, right? So you have the knowledge and you have the skills to be able to do the project within the written resource that you want to do, or you have the skills and the expertise necessary to do the project within the oral resources that you're trying to use. And so that's if you're kind of trying to pull, if you're doing research, if you're doing documentation. One of the other things to think about is, are you trying to create more of an oral history? Are you trying to create more of an oral record, right? That's a different type of project. It's about understanding where would you find that material? How are you going to start to document the material? Kind of like Leon had talked about.
How many of these languages, just my last follow-through question, turn out are transmitted in part because it's the secret language between parents? This is very true in Yiddish. It's the secret language between parents. Do the children learn it? Yes. But so it gets passed on in a indirect kind of way because parents speak whatever the language is. They don't really want their kids to learn it, but it gets passed on anyway. I wonder whether, I mean, I know that specifically for Yiddish, but is that true of indigenous language and the pattern of passing it on from generation to generation?
Well, I don't know that I can speak directly to documentation about that. What I can say is that there are a lot of indigenous youth and younger people who have a clear understanding of the language because they have heard it spoken between grandparents or parents or older people, but do not speak it. And if they're not going to speak it, it is not going to get passed down
Right.
from there.
See a hand up back there.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be in your presence today. My name is Gabriela Ventura. I'm with the University of Houston, and we have a program through the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Program that we recently received a grant from the NEH, a challenge grant, which we are tremendously grateful to you all for. And I am very interested in the way the programs that have been discussed for the collections of memory and how they're centered in memory and language. And I am especially interested in thinking about the way a lot of these communities are going to be made visible. And I would like to hear your voices regarding, or your comments regarding the complexity of discussing linguistic violence, violence against cultures that are not made visible on purpose, right? And how do we work towards that in a way that is, organic from the own communities that are represented, and also with the systems and power that will allow us to, invite, like, as you said, those communities that have not been represented. But how are we, working with those communities so that they feel that they are welcome in a lot of these spaces where they don't generally have developed, skills to be present in those spaces?
Would you both be willing to provide? We're almost at time, but I'm wondering if I could call upon you both to provide a brief response to this question, which I thought very wonderful. Thank you. Secretary General Moreau.
Thank you for that question. Actually, the Memory of the World Committee for Latin America and the Caribbean are very active, encouraging indigenous submissions for nomination. And there are a lot of inscriptions that aren't always, joyful. Some of them are the inscriptions related to genocide, the slave trade, violence against women. Because these are things that need to be acknowledged. And this is what documentary heritage is for us to remember. And and they purposely at the Memory of the World Committee for Latin and the Caribbean do not require the member states' support for anything to be inscribed. It will be looked at independently if it's put forward by a civil society organization or an indigenous peoples organization. So in the case of the International Memory of the World Program, they would require a member state letter. But in the case of Latin America, they will actually just speak to you directly. And so there wouldn't be any problems with the member states in case of an authoritarian government that would marginalize these communities. Thank you.
Right, one of the, I kind of have two answers. One, to more kind of point out that one of the things I said at the beginning was to make clear statements that this is important and that this work needs to be done. And then, of course, saying why this work needs to be done, right? So sharing really great examples, sharing the times where these languages have been recovered, these languages have been not restored, but put back into use, regardless of kind of the history of how that language has come to be where it is, that these are really great and important things to share and to let people know have happened. And the knowledge that has come out, like the bringing back of community that has come out of bringing these languages back. And this goes back to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, right? Making people aware that this is happening, not just in your community or not just in your region and state, but this is something that is happening globally, that it is a conversation, that it is important and people are paying attention globally. The other thing that I want to point to, she noted that they have a challenge grant. The other part of really ensuring that this work gets done and moving a lot of this documentary editing in particular forward is finding other resources that will continue to support it beyond NEH, right? NEH is one side of funding. There are other foundations that you can look at, but how do we get other organizations and foundations to start to think about the importance of this work and starting to also put funding and money into doing this work. So NEH challenge grants are a way to do that because you have to have matching funds, but we can all be really encouraging and telling organizations, institutions, countries, right, that this work needs to happen and there's value to it and more funding needs to go into it.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful way to end, actually. So I want to thank you again for both of you. Secretary General Moreau, thank you for joining us, and Chair Lowe of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Thank you. Justice team.
Thanks, everyone. Camp Director Serenity Sutherland here to tell us where to go next. So we will be headed off to a light reception, and that is sponsored by the National Coalition for History, the National Humanities Alliance, and the University of Virginia Press.
Oh, that's what you said.
I also just want to make a brief announcement that if you are planning to go on the tours this afternoon, please check the travel time between your destination and here, because some of them have a bit of a lengthier tour time. So please just double check that so you can make sure to arrive at 3:30 when the tours begin.
Or 3 for the Interior Department.
Pardon me, yes, for the 3 o'clock for the interior tour. Bad camp director.
And
Oh, there are directions.
I've had a
Thank you again for this wonderful session to the folks at NEH and the UNESCO. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Christine.